There's a question I've been asked more times than I can count in the 18 years since Carlo died. People ask it gently, carefully, with the particular delicacy they bring when they want to know something intimate. What were his last words? What did he say at the end? And I tell them the things that are appropriate to tell. The peace he had, the joy that never left him, the way he spoke about the Eucharist until he no longer had the strength to speak. These things are true, and they are beautiful, and they are what people expect to hear from the mother of a future saint. But there is something I have not told publicly. Something Carlo said on October 8th, 2006, 4 days before he died. Not as farewell, not as consolation, not as the gentle last words of a dying boy, but with the focused urgency of someone delivering a message intended for a specific moment that had not yet arrived. He told me why the demons are more afraid of Lenten fasting than of almost any other Catholic practice. He told me what actually happens in the invisible world, in the spiritual reality that runs beneath the surface of our ordinary days, when a person completes 40 days of genuine fasting offered with love. He told me about the chains it breaks, about the families it frees, about why hell mobilizes extraordinary resources every single Lent to make sure Catholics find a reason, a good reason, a legitimate reason, an apparently unavoidable reason, to stop. I kept this for 18 years because I did not know when it was meant to be given. Now I know. My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 63 years old, and I am the mother of Saint Carlo Acutis. I want to say something before I tell you what Carlo told me, because context matters for this particular story. I am a woman of faith, deeply, genuinely, for my entire adult life. But I am also a mother who spent 6 days sitting beside her son's hospital bed, watching him die. And I want you to understand the quality of attention I brought to everything he said during those days. When you know someone is leaving, you listen differently. You stop filtering for what is comfortable or expected or easy to receive. You hear everything with a completeness that ordinary conversation rarely achieves. You become, in those final days, the most attentive audience any person has ever had. Carlo was born on May 3rd, 1991, in London. He grew up in Milan, the city that shaped him and that he shaped in return, through his daily mass, through his rosary, through the Eucharistic miracle exhibition he built with the focused intelligence of someone who understood that faith and evidence were never enemies. He wore sneakers and played video games and laughed with the complete, uncalculating laughter of someone who had nothing to perform. He was 15 years old. He died on October 12th, 2006, of fulminant leukemia that moved through him in 9 days, with a totality that gave us almost no time to prepare and all the time we needed to say what mattered. In the days between his diagnosis and his death, Carlo's physical capacity diminished rapidly while something else, I have no clinical language for this, only the language of what I observed, intensified. His perception sharpened. His words carried a weight that they had always carried, but that became, in those final days, heavier in a way I could feel in my body when he spoke. On October 8th, 4 days before he died, he had been unable to eat for nearly 12 hours due to the deterioration caused by the chemotherapy. The medical team had reduced his food intake significantly. He was weak and in pain, and should by any ordinary reckoning have been focused entirely on his own suffering. Instead, he was focused on me. He held my hand and said, "Mama, I need to tell you something about fasting, about what it actually does. Not theologically, actually. In the real world." And his eyes had that quality I had come to recognize over 15 years, looking at something slightly beyond whatever was immediately in front of him. I sat down. I listened with everything I had. Before I tell you what Carlos said, I need to tell you about the years of not telling it. 18 years is a long time to carry something, especially something that does not fit neatly into the categories of things we ordinarily say about saints in their final words. What Carlo told me on October 8th was not gentle. It was not consoling in the conventional sense. It was, and I choose this word deliberately, tactical. It was the kind of information you give someone who is going to need it for a specific situation, the way a doctor tells you exactly what to watch for before sending you home. I told no one for years, not because I doubted it. I've never doubted it, not for a single moment. But because I understood, without being told explicitly, that this was not information to scatter broadly, it was information with a specific intended recipient, and that recipient was not yet visible. Every Lent, I watched. I watched our parish, watched the communities I was part of, watched what happened to people who committed to serious Lenten fasting, and what I observed quietly without making claims, simply noticing, aligned with what Carlo had described in that hospital room, with a consistency that did not allow me to write it off as coincidence. The sabotage patterns, the inexplicable crises that appear in the first 2 weeks of Lent, specifically for people who have committed to genuine fasting. The way these crises are always apparently legitimate, always providing a morally defensible reason to break the fast, always arriving with enough urgency that abandoning the sacrifice feels not like weakness, but like responsibility. I watched this for 17 years before I spoke about it publicly. I want to tell you why I finally understood it was time. Not because of a single dramatic event, because of an accumulation, a year in which I observed the pattern, not in one parish or one community, but globally, simultaneously, in Catholic groups I was part of across multiple countries. A year in which the coordination of what Carlo had described was simply too evident to continue holding privately. And because I began to see the other side of it. The people who recognized what was happening, who named it for what it was and continued fasting despite the crises, who arrived at Easter having completed 40 days, and what happened to those families afterward. The reconciliations that had seemed impossible. The conversions of relatives who had been hostile to faith for decades. The resolution of patterns that had been running in certain families for generations. Carlo had told me what to look for. I had been looking. Now I am telling you what I found. But first, what he told me. The hospital room had the particular quality of stillness that hospital rooms acquire after a certain point. Not peaceful stillness, but the stillness of a place where ordinary time has been suspended, where what matters has been compressed into small hours, where words carry more than their usual weight because there is a consciousness present in every person in the room that some number of words remain and no one knows how many. Carlo's hand in mine was warm. He had always run warm. I used to tease him when he was small that he generated more heat than a grown man twice his size. Even in those last days, even with the leukemia taking more of him daily, there was warmth. He had been watching me for several minutes before he spoke. I had been trying not to cry, which was an activity that consumed a significant amount of my energy during those 6 days. Mama, tjai, he said. You know why I feel peaceful even though I haven't eaten today? I told him I assumed it was grace, that his peace was the gift of someone close to God. It is grace, Mike, and he agreed. But it's also because I can see something. Because of the fasting, the involuntary kind, which Jesus is accepting as the voluntary kind on my behalf, I can see things I usually can't see as clearly. What kind of things? He was quiet for a moment, with the quality of someone looking carefully at something that requires careful looking. The war, Mama, the ongoing war, the one that's always happening around us and that most people never see because they're never quiet enough and hungry enough to perceive it. I asked him to tell me. He told me. Before I share what Carlo described, I want to say something to you directly. If you have ever started a Lenten fast with genuine commitment and found yourself within days you're facing a cascade of apparently unavoidable reasons to break it, this story is for you. If you have felt the specific frustration of watching your sacrifice collapse under the weight of circumstances that felt outside your control, what Carlos said will name something you have experienced without having language for. And if you want to begin this Lent with the understanding he gave me and with the full picture of what you are doing when you fast and why it matters with a specificity that ordinary Lenten catechesis rarely conveys. 7 Days with Carlo is in the description below, including his specific approach to fasting, the prayer he used when offering hunger, the way he framed physical deprivation as spiritual authority. It will be there when this ends. Now, October 8th. Carlo's hand in mine. The hospital room's compressed stillness. Let me tell you what my son could see. He began with the first sin, not as a theological abstraction, as a strategic analysis. Carlo always thought in terms of systems, in terms of how things actually worked. And he applied the same instinct to the spiritual world with the same precision he applied to everything else. The first human failure, Ivan, he said, was disobedience about food. Do you understand what that means strategically, Mama? Not symbolically, strategically. I said I was listening. It means that the enemy's first and most proven point of entry into human freedom is appetite, not violence, not pride in its obvious forms. Appetite. The impulse to take what is available because it is available, to satisfy the immediate want without reference to any higher order of things. He shifted slightly in the bed, finding a position that accommodated the pain without surrendering to it, a small, constant negotiation I had watched him conduct for days. Every time a person chooses not to eat when they could eat, genuinely chooses, with love as an offering, they are reversing the motion of the first sin. They are saying, in their body and not just in their mind, I have an appetite and I am choosing not to follow it. Something other than my hunger governs my actions. He looked at me steadily. This is why fasting has power that prayer alone does not always have. Prayer is the voice, fasting is the body. When both speak together in the same direction, with the same intention, the authority of that speech is of a different order. What do you mean by authority? I asked. I mean that certain spiritual chains, certain patterns of bondage that have become established in a family over generations, cannot be broken by prayer alone. They require the body's participation. They require someone in the family to make the choice in their flesh that reverses the original pattern of the flesh that established the bondage. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they had that quality, the looking at something beyond what is immediately present quality that I had seen since he was a small child and that had intensified dramatically in these last days. I can see the chains, Mama. I have been able to see them more clearly since the fasting began. They are not metaphors. They are real structures. Invisible, but real in the way that gravity is real. You cannot see it, but you feel its effects constantly. What kinds of chains? I asked, though part of me was not entirely certain I wanted the answer. The patterns that repeat in families without explanation. The grandfather who drank and the father who drank and the son who swore he would never drink in drinks. The pattern of infidelity that moves through a family line like an inheritance no one chose. The specific variety of pride or cowardice or cruelty that appears generation after generation in different people, but with the same essential shape. He opened his eyes fully. These patterns have custodians. I do not want to be dramatic about this. It is simply what I can see. There are specific spiritual presences whose function is to maintain these patterns, to ensure that the vulnerability is exploited in each generation, to make the chain appear to be simply human nature, simply the way this family is, simply inevitable. And fasting breaks them? Genuine Lenten fasting, 40 days, offered with love, completed without abandonment, creates what I can only describe as fractures in those chains. Not necessarily complete breaks in one Lenten season, but fractures. Points of weakness that prayer can then work through. Openings for grace that were sealed before. He held my gaze. This is why the enemy works so hard to prevent it. Tell me about the sabotage. I said. Carlo almost smiled. Not with humor. With the recognition of someone who has observed something so consistent that it has become almost predictable. He is not creative, Carlo said. This is important to understand, Mama. The enemy is ancient and experienced and extraordinarily patient, but he is not particularly creative. He uses the same approaches repeatedly because they work repeatedly, and the approach he uses against Lenten fasting is always a variation of the same move, the apparently legitimate obstacle, not a temptation, he continued. Temptations are recognizable. Catholics who are fasting seriously are on guard against temptations. What he sends instead is a crisis, something that requires your attention, something that provides not an excuse to sin, but a reason, a defensible, morally weighty reason to break your fast. He described the pattern with specificity. It almost always happens in the first 2 weeks. This is when the fast is new enough that you have not yet established the rhythm of it, when breaking it costs the least in terms of lost momentum, when the sacrifice is recent enough that resuming feels possible, when you have not yet experienced the deeper effects that come from completing the early weeks. The first 2 weeks are the most strategically valuable to interrupt. What does the interruption look like? It wears the face of necessity. A family member's sudden illness that requires your full presence and makes maintaining a fasting schedule feel selfish. A professional obligation that includes meals and where abstaining would damage important relationships. A health concern of your own that a doctor, always someone whose authority you trust, it says requires food. A beloved person visiting unexpectedly who will be hurt if you don't eat with them. He paused. Notice, none of these are sins. None of these are temptations toward evil. Each one is a legitimate claim on your attention and your charity. Each one provides a reason to break the fast that you can articulate to yourself and to God without shame. That is precisely the design. How do you recognize it? I asked. By the timing and the pattern, he said. If you have committed to serious Lenten fasting, and within the first 14 days you face a sequence of apparently unrelated obstacles to maintaining that fast, ask yourself, would these same obstacles have appeared if I had not committed to fasting? Is the timing striking? Is each obstacle providing exactly the justification needed? He looked at me with complete seriousness. Mama, I am not saying that every difficulty during Lent is an attack. I am not saying that legitimate health needs should be ignored, or that charity toward family should be abandoned for the sake of a fast. The Church's own teaching provides for dispensations from fasting when there is genuine need. None of that changes. What changes is the awareness when you understand that serious fasting is a genuine threat to spiritual bondage, and that this threat prompts a genuine response. You approach the obstacles differently. You examine them. You ask whether the obstacle is real or manufactured. You ask what completing the fast, despite the obstacle, might accomplish, that abandoning it would prevent. He was quiet for a moment. And when you recognize an obstacle as what it is, when you name it internally as an attempt to interrupt something important, something shifts. The recognizing itself is a form of resistance. The naming reduces the obstacle's power. Carlo sat up slightly. He had been lying back against the pillows, but this portion of what he wanted to say seemed to require a more upright posture. The posture of someone delivering important information who wants to be sure it is received clearly. There are 3 levels of what Lenten fasting accomplishes. Piek said, most people only understand the first level. I want to tell you about all 3. The first level is individual. When you fast with genuine love for 40 days, you are changed. Not just disciplined, changed. The specific weakness of will that appetite exploits, the specific vulnerability to immediate gratification that the enemy uses as his primary access point. This is addressed at a level that mental resolution alone cannot reach. The body participates in the transformation. The flesh learns through 40 days of repeated choice that it does not govern. This is not a small thing. He held up 2 fingers. The second level is familial. This is the one I described earlier, and the generational chains. When a person fasts on behalf of their family, specifically naming family members in the intention, specifically asking for the breaking of inherited patterns, the fasting operates on those patterns in a way that prayer offered without bodily sacrifice does not. I do not fully understand the mechanism. I can only tell you what I can see. What do you see? I see that completed Lenten fasts create what looks like light in the spiritual structure around a family. Fractures in the chains I described, weak points that had been sealed. After a season of genuine fasting, there are openings, not guaranteed resolutions, but openings, where there were none before. Grace can move through those openings in ways it could not previously. He raised a 3rd finger. The 3rd level is communal. This is the one the Church has always known instinctively, which is why communal fasting was always built into the Lenten structure. Not just individual discipline, but the Church fasting together. When enough people in a community, a city, a region complete genuine fasts simultaneously, The combined effect creates what I can only describe as a change in spiritual atmosphere. The specific demonic presences that maintain bondage over communities, over cities, over regions, over generations, are weakened by collective fasting in a way they are not weakened by individual prayer. He looked at me steadily. This is not magic. It is not a formula. It does not work automatically or mechanically. It requires genuine love in the offering, genuine willingness to suffer the deprivation for the sake of Christ and neighbor. A fast performed resentfully or for show accomplishes none of this. Only the genuine offering has the weight I am describing. How does a person ensure their fasting is genuine? I asked. Carlo thought about this for a moment. By being honest about the cost. The fast that costs nothing is not a fast. It is a performance of fasting. The cost is what makes the offering real. When you are genuinely hungry, when the hunger is inconvenient, when maintaining the fast requires an actual decision rather than a passive continuation of comfort, that is when the offering has weight. He paused. And by maintaining the intention throughout, the first morning of Lent, you can offer the fast in a prayer that names its purpose for your family, for the breaking of specific patterns, for the conversion of specific people, for the purification of the community. That intention does not need to be renewed in every moment of hunger, but it should be renewed each morning, simply and briefly. The hunger during the day draws its meaning from the morning intention. He relaxed back against the pillows. His energy was not inexhaustible, even in those intense days. Mama, he said quietly, remember this. Keep it until the moment when people need to hear it. And when you give it to them, tell them that the difficulty of maintaining a fast is not evidence that the fast is wrong. It is evidence that the fast is right. Hell does not deploy resources against harmless practices. I kept what Carlo told me with the care I would keep anything entrusted to me, to completely privately, with attention to whether each Lent brought further evidence or contradicted what he had described. It never contradicted it. What it did over 18 years was accumulate. The first year after Carlo died, I was too deep in grief to observe carefully. The Lent of 2008 was simply survival. I attended Mass and I prayed and I endured. But from 2009 onward, I began to watch with the specific attention Carlo had given me. I watched what happened to people in my communities who committed to serious Lenten fasting. I noted the patterns, not scientifically, not with a researcher's rigor. I am a mother, not an academic, but with the systematic attention of someone who has been told exactly what to look for and wants to verify whether what she was told is true. The sabotage pattern appeared every year. Not to everyone, to those who had committed to something genuinely demanding, something with real cost. To those fasting lightly or performatively, I observed nothing unusual. But to those who had entered Lent with serious commitment, the first 2 weeks consistently brought obstacles of the kind Carlo had described. Legitimate seeming, urgent feeling, arriving in sequence rather than isolation. I began gently pointing this out in spiritual direction conversations, not proclaiming it publicly, not building a teaching around it, simply noting, in one-on-one conversations with people I trusted, that the obstacles arriving in the first weeks of Lent might be worth examining rather than simply accepting. The response, consistently, was recognition. Not surprise, recognition. People knew what I was describing because they had experienced it year after year without having language for it. They had attributed it to coincidence, to their own weakness, to God testing them. The idea that it was a systematic response to the specific threat of their fasting was new to them, but it landed with the particular resonance of something that explains a pattern that has been confusing for years. And on the other side, the people who named what was happening, who continued their fast despite the cascade of obstacles, who arrived at Easter having completed 40 days. What happened to those families was consistent in a way that I began to find impossible to attribute to anything except what Carlo had described. If you want to carry this understanding into your own Lenten fasting, the full picture of what you are doing and why its completion matters, 7 days with Carlo includes the specific daily fasting practice Carlo observed, the morning intention prayer that directs the hunger toward its purpose, and the evening examination he used to process the day's cost and offer it deliberately. 7 days of practice drawn from his actual life. The link is in the description below. Let me tell you about the families. I will tell you about three because I have their permission and because each one illustrates a different level of what Carlo described. The first is a family in Rome, a woman I will call Lucia, now in her late 50s, whose family had a pattern of broken marriages running through 3 generations on her father's side. Her grandfather, her father, 2 of her uncles, all of whose marriages had ended in abandonment and infidelity. Her own marriage had been struggling for years, not dramatically, but with the specific low-grade erosion that can eventually take a marriage apart. She completed a serious Lenten fast in 2016, offering it specifically for the breaking of this pattern in her family. She encountered in the second week a cascade of obstacles: her mother's hospitalization, a professional crisis, a conflict with her daughter that required extensive attention. She continued the fast through all of it, naming each obstacle as she encountered it and choosing to continue. Within 8 months of that Easter, her eldest son, who had been moving toward repeating the family pattern in his own young marriage, underwent what he described as an inexplicable shift in his understanding of commitment. The marriage recovered and deepened. Her younger brother, who had been on the edge of leaving his wife, returned. The pattern did not simply continue into the next generation. Lucia says, "I cannot prove causation. I can only tell you what happened and when." The second family is from a parish in Warsaw. A man I will call Marek, 60 years old, who had struggled with alcoholism for 20 years. Not the visible, collapsed variety, but the functional kind that maintains appearances while quietly consuming everything inside them. His father had the same pattern and his grandfather before him. He completed a Lenten fast in 2019 that he described as the most difficult thing he had ever done. The fasting itself was the smallest part of the difficulty. The obstacles, arriving in sequence, were the larger test. He named each one. He continued. He told me, "On Easter Sunday, I felt something release. Not a feeling I would have been able to describe beforehand, but completely recognizable after. Like a tension that had been present so long I had stopped noticing it, simply was no longer there." He has been sober since that Easter. His son, now 27, never developed the pattern. Marek attributes this specifically to the fast. The third is not a dramatic story. It is a woman from Milan whose name I will not use, whose family carried a pattern of bitter estrangements. People who had stopped speaking to each other across decades over offenses long since forgotten by the people outside the family who had witnessed them. This pattern had repeated for her grandmother, her mother, and had begun in her own generation. She fasted for 40 days in 2021, offering the fast for reconciliation, encountering 5 separate obstacles in the first 2 weeks, and continuing through all of them. Her estranged sister called her on the Saturday before Easter. Neither of them had spoken in 11 years. "She didn't know I had been fasting," the woman told me. "She had no idea. She simply called. She said she didn't know why, that she had found herself thinking about me for weeks and finally picked up the phone." They met for coffee on Easter Monday. They have met regularly since. Lent is either beginning or approaching or continuing as you hear this. And Carlo's question, the question implicit in everything he told me on October 8th, 2006, in a hospital room in Monza with the October light coming through the window and his hand warm in mine, is this: do you understand what you are actually doing when you fast? Not the discipline of it, not the sacrifice of it in the abstract. The specific, targeted, strategically significant act of choosing in your body to reverse the first motion of human failure. The act that creates fractures and chains. The act that opens what was sealed. The act that, completed despite the obstacles through the full 40 days, has power over patterns that have been running in your family for longer than you have been alive. The enemy knows this. This is Carlo's most important message. The difficulty of your fast is not evidence that God is testing you, or that you are weak, or that the practice is not working. It is evidence that the practice is working. Hell does not mobilize against harmless things. When the crisis arrives in the second week, when the obligation appears that seems to make continuing the fast irresponsible, I want you to do what Carlo told me. Examine it. Ask whether it would have appeared if you had not committed to fasting. Ask what completing the fast, despite it, might accomplish. Name what you see, quietly and internally, and choose. Not every obstacle is an attack. Some are simply life, which continues regardless of our spiritual calendar. The Church's provisions for legitimate need exist for good reason and should be honored. But some obstacles are exactly what Carlo described. And the people who recognize them, who name them for what they are and continue, arrive at Easter differently than the people who didn't. Leave me a comment. Tell me if you have experienced this pattern. The cascade of apparently legitimate obstacles in the first weeks of a serious Lenten fast. Tell me if something in Carlo's description names an experience you have had without having language for it. I read everyone. Share this with someone entering Lent without this understanding, who is planning to fast but does not yet know why the fast will be difficult in the specific way it will be difficult, who does not yet know that the difficulty is confirmation rather than contradiction. Carlo told me to give this message to the people who needed it. He told me I would know when the moment arrived. Every Lent is that moment. Saint Carlo Acutis, who could see the war even when the rest of us couldn't, who spent his last conscious days giving his mother the tools she would need for 18 years of watching. Pray for us who are fasting this Lent. Pray for the families carrying chains we never asked to carry. Pray for the people in their second week facing the obstacle that was designed specifically to interrupt what they started. Give them the grace to continue. And teach us as you always taught, and with evidence, with specificity, with the patient precision of someone who understood that truth does not fear scrutiny, that the ancient practices of the Church are ancient for a reason. They work. Amen.